Good morning. Happy Sabbath. It was a few years ago, probably more than 25 years ago. The small school, Adventist school in Central America and Costa Rica known as Una decided to do an outreach to the community. One of the problems that they were facing is that a lot of the communities around the school, even though it was an Adventist school, did not know about the message. And one of the regions that had been most affected was a small town up in the mountains of a volcano known as Volcano Poás. And really the only church that was prevalent there was the Catholic Church. No other religion was basically allowed. So the university decided that with the help of students, they were going to try to bring the message to the town, starting with the kids. So they enlisted volunteers from the small college. And Grace wasn't very keen about knocking on people's doors, but what she could do is tell children's stories. So she signed up, and she decided to go with the rest of the students, and she liked it so much and got so enthralled by it that she decided to keep on going back, not only for a time that they were giving the series, but actually she went on going back every Saturday. But sadly, one of the things that she noticed is that the kids didn't really have any material to teach the Bible stories. They had no coloring books, they had nothing, absolutely nothing for her to teach. Whatever she could take or she can afford on her small college fund, she had to pay herself through college, she would take to the children. And this really started to bother her a lot. She's like, I need a way to teach these children the Bible stories because they don't know anything about it. So, prompted by that, she went to the ABC representative over there, and she asked how much would it be to buy the whole Bible set and felt to teach children the Bible stories. The guy said it was going to be $225 if she wanted to buy it. The problem was that Grace only had $225 to put for her tuition. It wasn't enough to pay for her whole tuition, but it was enough for the university to let her enroll. So she was in a conundrum. Should I help the children, or should I pay for tuition? In her mind, it was very, very simple. She kneeled down and she said, God, please give me money for my tuition because I am going to buy this for the children. There's just no way out. So she goes and she gathers all her money. She goes to the representative and she's like, I am buying this. He's like, out of pocket? She's like, yeah. He's like, should I bill it to a church? She's like, no, I'm paying for it. So she buys this and she takes, she has to cut it and all, all the material came and the children's, she says that the face of the children were so happy because it was so easy for them now to understand the Bible stories. But the problem is that she didn't have any money to pay for school now. Her partner back then told her she was crazy, which was very interesting because he was studying to be a pastor. And he's like, why would you do that? You're probably are going to have to go back home and work more to be able to pay for tuition. But a week later, the pastor of the church called her in and he said, Grace, there is one person, one sponsor from the U.S. that is looking to sponsor specifically a woman for her studies. And the only person I can think of is you. Your tuition is paid for the rest of their 2 years in college. It's all covered. Grace dared to ask God for more. And those stories and those materials went with my mom throughout the mountains of Costa Rica, through the deserts and the jungles of Guatemala. And up to this day, she still has them there, ready for any child who needs them. She believed that God can give her more. And this morning, we're going to study the story of 5 women. It's not a separate story. It's the story of 5 sisters who dared to go up, not only to God, but to Moses and to the congregation, and demand to get more. So I'm going to put you and give you a little bit of the background of where these women were. They were part of the country of Israel, of the nation of Israel. And Israel wandered through the desert for a lot of time. Yes, Israel was delivered from the Egyptians. They saw a lot of miracles. But when the time came in order to be able to go conquer the land of Canaan, the Israelites didn't believe that God could be with them. They got scared. They said, oh, the Canaanites are big. They're going to crush us like little bugs. We're not going to go. And because they didn't have faith in God, that God can give and deliver Canaan to them, God said, now you have to go and wander for 40 years in the desert. And the story that we're going to study today is almost at the end of those 40 years. We're going to see that the Israelites went through a lot of tribulations through those 40 years, but God was always there protecting them. But usually, as the Israelites did, they moved, and they were starting to move towards Canaan to get ready to conquer, because most of the people that were supposed to die in the desert during those 40 years had already died. So the people moved, and they moved from wherever they were to Moab. And there in Moab, something interesting happened, is that when the king of Moab said that the Israelites were near the Moab, he had heard of the God of Israel, and he asked Balaam to go and curse the people, but as we know the story goes, Balaam couldn't curse them. He just blessed them. And so the king of Moab was not very happy with that, but something interesting happened after the story of Balaam. And what happened was that the kids, or the people of Israel, specifically the men of Israel, decided that they didn't want Israelite wives. They decided that it was better for them if they went to look for wives in Moab. And so instead of bringing the Moabite women into the camp of Israel and teaching the ways of the Lord, they decided to follow the religion of their wives. And God was very, very angered when this happened, because now the people of Israel started to worship Baal and Peor, and God was so mad that what he said to Moses that he had to do is to take all these people who had wives that were from Moab, put it in front of the congregation in plain daylight, and he was going to send a plague to kill them all. So the people of Israel were suffering through this very traumatic experience for them. They were seeing their loved ones killed and dying, and this plague is going through the camp of Israel. But there's always one person in Israel, he's like, I don't care about the plague. And so there he came, and in the eyes, this is what the Bible said, in the eyes of Moses, he came into the camp with a woman from Midian, and he took her to her tent, even though the plague was going on throughout the whole camp of Israel. And it says that Eliezer, the son of Aaron, who was the high priest, was so mad at this incident that he went into the tent and he killed them both. And after he killed them both, the plague was stopped. But by that time, 24,000 people of Israel had already died. So this is where we are in the story. And because so many people all the people had died in the desert, plus now 24,000 people had died because of this plague, one of the things that the people of Israel had to do in Moses now was that he had to make a census. And he had to make a census because the people of Israel were about to go and conquer Canaan. And they needed to know how many people were per tribe, because God told Moses and Joshua, we're going to give we're going to divide the land according on how big the tribe is. If you have a big tribe, you're going to get a lot of land. If you have a small tribe, you're going to get a small portion of land. This is depending on how many people each tribe has. So Moses, Aaron, and Joshua go ahead and do the census over the people. And they bring all the census together. And right after the census, God calls Aaron up to the mountain where Aaron dies, and now his son Eliezer is the high priest. And this is where our story starts. If you go with me to Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 27, we're going to find the story of these 5 sisters that I would say demanded more from God. We're going to read chapter 27, Numbers 27, verses 1 to verses 11. And it says, "The daughters of Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, belonged to the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of the daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Oglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They came forward and stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and said, 'Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the Korah followers.'" So Korah was a big rebellion. And so they wanted to establish that their father had not died because he had rebelled against Moses, Aaron, or God, who band them together against the Lord, but he died for his own sins and left no sons. "Why should our father's name, disappear from his clan because he had no sons? Give us property among our father's relatives." I think Moses was stumped by that demand because they didn't really ask. They said, "Give us property among our father's relatives." So Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it. This is to have the force of the law for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses." And that's where the story ends, or at least that's where we think the story ends. So the girls, or the 5 sisters, go in front of Moses, and they demand that they should have inheritance among her father's brothers. And it seems, we know that God said they're right. They should have inheritance among everybody else. And there appeared to be no objections. But really, if we go further on into specifically Numbers 36, we see that there was an issue. And the issue was that once the Manasseh people came up to Moses and said, "We have no problem giving these women their inheritance. We're happy to do so. The problem is that what if they marry somebody that's not from our tribe? When the Jubilee comes, which would be every 25 or 50 years, then they can go, and all the land that was inherited to them are going to go to the tribe of their husbands, and therefore we're going to lose the land that God has given us when we go and conquer Canaan." So the solution was the petition was brought up to God, and God said, "What they are saying is right. The only thing I'm going to ask from these 5 sisters is that they can marry whoever they want as long they're in the Manasseh tribe." And that's the agreement that they arrived, and they actually went on and married people or men that were part of the Manasseh tribe. But their story doesn't end there just yet. between the agreement that they had made with Moses and all the congregation, Moses died. The Israelites go and conquer the land, and now they're not under Moses anymore. They're actually under Joshua. And Joshua is the one that led the people into Canaan. They took Jericho. And now Joshua is the one that's giving the people or the different tribes the land. And if we go to Joshua in chapter 17, we're going to see that these 5 sisters also appear again. Specifically, in verse 3, it says, "Now Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, had no sons, but only daughters, whose names were Mahlah, Noah, Aglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They went to Eliezer, the priest, Joshua, son of Nun, and the leaders, and said, 'The Lord commanded Moses to give us our inheritance among our relatives.' So Joshua gave them an inheritance along with the brothers of their father according to the Lord's command." And that's where their story ends. Now, this is a very interesting story because I think there's a lot of lessons and applications that we can learn from here. I think there is the very obvious one that, God is a just God. Doesn't care about gender. He says, these women are right. You should give them their inheritance. But this is not what I want to highlight from this story. There's actually 3 lessons while I read this story that came to mind. And I think one of the first lessons is that this story highlights the character of God, specifically the loving character of God of the Old Testament. A lot of times when we think of the God of the Old Testament, we think of a God that is very harsh, a God that has a very short fuse. He gives out very harsh punishment to people that don't obey him. He just, he just sent a plague, killed 24,000 people. That, in a lot of sense, that is not a loving God to us. A lot of people, specifically a lot of religions, have decided to forget about the God of the Old Testament and focus more on the loving, nurturing God of the New Testament. He's like, yeah, I know the God of the Old Testament. He has a lot of issues, we understand, but let's focus on the God of the New Testament. He is a loving God. He's the one that allows everybody to come together. That's the God that we want to focus on. But the reality is that our God is the same of the Old Testament that we see in the New Testament. Our God is constant. And I think one of the things that is mostly highlighted in this story is the loving character of God, specifically through the plague. Let me explain why specifically through the plague. The sisters, these women, these 5 women, experience God in a very different way that we experience God. I know that a lot of us may have a very close relationship with God, and maybe you say, I can hear God, I pray, I go down, and I can hear God speaking to me. I hear God speaking to me through his word, and I think that a lot of us can reach a close relationship with God. But these women experience God, something that we will never get to experience. It's because they could see the presence of God there with them. They received the manna. They saw the column of fire. They saw the cloud above them. They were there for the plague. For them, God was very real. They could see how much God loved Israel by protecting them, but they also could see how much God, if you did something wrong, God was going to be there to punish you. For them, God was extremely real. It was a very different relationship of what they had to experience God as what we had to experience God. So for them, they understood if they did something wrong, they could be put to death. At the same time, they understood that God loved them so much that they had protected them throughout 40 years in the wilderness. The other thing that I think this highlights the character of God is because the request that these 5 women had was not a usual request. We don't know a lot about women's rights in Canaan, but we do know about some of the other tribes that surrounded Canaan and Israel back then. And we learn a little bit about this through archaeology of the Ugarit women. Ugarit was a port city near Syria, and the Ugarit, kingdom happened along the same time as Canaan and as Israel was trying to conquer Canaan. And what we learn from them is that, first of all, not a lot of women are mentioned in any of what they have found. They probably have only mentioned 2 women throughout the whole documents. And the other thing that really was highlighted to me is that under no circumstance, it's not like, no, maybe in a special circumstance. No, under no circumstance in the surrounding clans could a woman inherit land. She could buy land if she had enough money, her husband had enough money or she had enough money to buy land while she was alive. But once she died, she couldn't pass down that land to her daughters. It was just impossible. There was no rule, like women could not inherit land, period. So when these 5 sisters come to this request, or more specifically a demand, to Moses, to Eliezer, to the leaders of the land, and in front of the whole congregation, this took a lot of courage for them to do. Because they couldn't say like, the Canaanites or the Ugarites or the Egyptians or anybody else, they inherit land, women inherit land over there, so, allow us to inherit land here. No. They were asking something that none of the surrounding people, none of their surrounding community had ever done. However, they had the courage to go in front of Moses and of the high priest and in front of the leaders and actually demand an inheritance. And I want you to understand the courage these women had to have to do this. It's because in that time, if you would say something that was not in accordance to God, you can be put to death. They saw people that did not obey God and have a plague sent to them and be put to death. And anyhow, even though they knew that they probably could, if they were not right or they were not, their petition was not righteous, they could have severe consequences. They still decided to go and make the petition. Why? Well, I think that the God of the Old Testament that those 5 sisters experienced was a loving God. They understood God in a different way. They had the chance to know the God of the Old Testament, and when they got together and they say, we're going to go and ask for inheritance, it's because they knew that God was going to be on their side. They understood the God of the Old Testament as a God of a loving person, of a loving father, that even though their father had died, they say, like, if we petition God, if we go on to Moses and say, go inquire from God, because that's the literal translation. They said, Moses, go and inquire from God, go ask God, and tell them that we want an inheritance. But they understood. For them, God was so personal and so loving that they had the courage to tell Moses, go and ask for God, because we know that the God of Israel is a protector to everyone. And if we ask this from him, he will provide for us. And that is such a powerful statement. Because for a long time, the God of the Old Testament is put as a patriarchal God, as a God that does not love women or doesn't love the disenfranchised or the orphans or the widows. But here we see 5 women that have no basis from other communities, from other people around them, but they experience a God, a very different God, that they know that this God will provide for them. The loving God of the Old Testament. I think that's one of the lessons that we can learn from them. I think the second lesson that we can learn from these 5 sisters, the daughters of Zelophehad, is that you have to ask. You have to ask. Now, you may say, Abby, you just made this big case that the God of Israel is a loving God, and if he's a loving God, he knew that these sisters needed inheritance. He knew that they had the right to inherit land. Why didn't he just go ahead and tell Moses and establish it from the beginning? Oh, and by the way, if he has no sons, just give the inheritance to their daughters. It wasn't hard. God knew that he was going to establish that law. He is all-knowing. Why didn't he just establish it from the beginning? But I think one of the reasons that these sisters had to go ask, and why we as people, and today have to go ask from God, it's not because God doesn't know our necessities. It's not because God doesn't know what we need. God knows what we need before we even know it. God knows exactly what would make our life easier. But the reason why God wants us to go and ask and request from him is because that helps us to establish faith in God. I know that God knew that the sisters needed to inherit land. I know he knew that was the just thing to do. But God also needed the sisters to know and to experience him. He needed the sisters to be able to sit down and see, we love God. The experience, the relationship we have established with the God of our Father is so good that we trust that he will provide for us. And that's the same lesson that we have today. A lot of times God does know what we need, but we have to request from God what we want from him, because that way we're telling God, God, I know that you are my provider. I know that because you have shown me one day and day again that you are a provider, that you are a faithful God, that if I go and pray and earnestly pray to you, you will provide for me. You will provide my request, because I believe that you are a powerful God. God asks us to ask stuff from him, not because he doesn't know. It's because he wants to establish that faith, that faithfulness, that relationship, that faith between us and God, to know that he will always provide for us. In select messages from Ellen G. White, it said that ministering angels are waiting by the throne of God to just answer the command of God to go and fulfill the request of those people who earnestly pray to him. And that many times we are missing all those wonderful blessings simply because we do not request. We must ask. And I think the third question, or the third lesson that we learn from these 5 sisters is that we must take responsibility for the requests that we do. And what do I mean by taking responsibility? So the 5 sisters, in order to be able to go in front of Moses and all the people of Israel and make this request or this demand by God, they had to take the time to actually know the God of Israel. They could have never known that God was a loving God, that God would fulfill their request if they had not taken the time to know God. I think that's one of the lessons a lot of the times we don't request things from God because we don't take the time to learn or to get to know God at a more personal level. We may say, God is not going to give us that, or we don't want to request something from God because we haven't taken the time to get to know him. We think that we're not worthy of the request. But if we take the time to learn and get to know God in a better way, we're going to start understanding that he is willing to give us everything we want. But we have to take the responsibility and the time to get to know him. Not only did the sisters take the time to learn to know God, but they also took the responsibility upon them to be productive members of the community. What they were going to go and request from Moses and all the leaders was not an easy thing. And anybody could come and say, oh, they don't deserve it. They don't deserve it. If we give them the land, they are not going to cultivate it. They're not going to be good stewardships of the land. But nobody had a problem with Moses inheriting the land to this woman because they had a good standing in their community. It is said that it's not easy to get your name in the Bible, but it specifically mentions their name because they had a good standing in the community of the Israelites. And that's why, some commentators said that nobody opposed their request to inherit the land. And that's a lot what we have to take responsibility to ask from God. It's not only getting to know from God, it's also to put ourselves in a place where we're ready to receive the blessings that God has given to us. And this not necessarily mean that we have to be perfect. A lot of the times, just when we want to receive something, if we just, if we're in a state of desperation, if we know that we need God, it's because we have come to the conclusion, we have come to understand that we are not perfect people and that only God can change us. And that has put our heart in a place where we are ready not only to accept the blessings from God, but also accept the everlasting power of change that God can have in our lives. We have to be responsible not only about getting to know God, but also being responsible to be ready to receive the blessings that he is willing to give us. The responsibility that they received was not only would you inherit the land, they also had to go and fulfill certain requirements. And the requirements were you have to marry somebody within your tribe, whoever you want, but it has to be in your tribe. And they fulfilled those requirements with no issue. But I think one of the things that they also teach us at the end is that once you request, you should keep on requesting. And the thing is that they could have said easily, Moses said that he was going to give us the land, and that is it. We were good standing in the community when we made the request, and we will assume that Joshua and the high priest will remember us when they had to inherit the land. But no, they only keep a good standing in the community when they made the request with Moses. They kept on having a good standing in the community. And when they went and asked from Joshua and Eliezer, remember, Moses gave us that land, and we must inherit it. And I think that sometimes is hard for us. We request from God. It's easy to request when we are in tribulation, and it's easy for us to say, God, help us. And then the blessings come, and we forget that we have to continuously keep on knowing God and keep on preparing our hearts. And that's one of the things that I want to remind us today all. Not only should we request, but we should continuously get to know God and continuously request from him because he has everlasting blessings from us. May we always remember that our God is an everlasting Father and he is always there ready to provide for us. And that we always remember to get to know the God of the Bible, of the Old Testament, the everlasting God of the Old Testament, that we request and that we may be responsible of the blessings that come our way. May God bless you.